She was a size 22 accountant, drowning in debt. He was the brutal heir to the Chicago syndicate. When Beatrice stumbled into a blood-soaked warehouse, she didn't just witness a murder. She became the ultimate obsession of a monster who chained her to his empire and refused to let go. Beatrice Gallagher was used to being invisible. Society had long ago decided that a woman of her size, 280 pounds, carrying the weight in wide, soft hips and a thick midsection, was meant to blend into the background of a boardroom. She was accustomed to the condescending glances, the unsolicited health advice from her passive-aggressive boss, Gregory Walsh, and the way men's eyes slid right past her at bars. But Beatrice didn't mind the invisibility. In her line of work as a senior auditor for Midwest Global Freight in Chicago, being overlooked was her greatest asset. It allowed her to see the numbers everyone else was desperately trying to hide. It was a bleak, rain-swept Tuesday in late November when the numbers finally stopped adding up. Beatrice sat in her cubicle, the harsh fluorescent lights humming overhead, nursing a cold cup of coffee. She was running a routine reconciliation on a newly acquired subsidiary, a string of import warehouses scattered along the industrial skirts of the city. The ledger was a mess, but as she dug deeper, the mess began to look deliberate. Millions of dollars were being categorized under vague shipping expenses for a company registered to an Arthur Pendleton, a man who, according to public records, had been dead for 3 years. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't corporate negligence. This was sophisticated high-level money laundering. And Midwest Global Freight was right at the center of it. Instead of going to Gregory, who she now suspected was receiving a hefty payout to look the other way, Beatrice decided to verify the physical inventory. She needed proof. Wrapping her thick wool coat tightly around her frame, she grabbed her keys and drove her beat-up Honda Civic to Warehouse 42 near the docks. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the streetlights into smeared halos. Warehouse 42 was a colossal, rusting structure near the edge of the water. Beatrice parked 2 blocks away and walked her boots splashing in oily puddles. The sheer physicality of her body made sneaking difficult. She was breathing heavily by the time she reached the rusted side door. To her surprise, it was slightly ajar. She slipped inside, the heavy scent of motor oil, damp cardboard, and copper hitting her nostrils. The vast interior was pitch black, save for a pool of harsh yellow light at the far end of the building. Beatrice crept closer, using towering stacks of wooden pallets as cover. As she peered around the edge of a crate, the breath was knocked from her lungs. A man was on his knees in the center of the concrete floor. He was beaten unrecognizable, his expensive suit ruined. Standing over him was a man whose face Beatrice recognized instantly from the late-night local news broadcasts she watched with her roommate, Lorenzo Costa. Lorenzo was the undisputed heir to the Costa crime family. He was terrifyingly elegant, dressed in a bespoke charcoal overcoat that repelled the damp chill of the warehouse. He held a suppressed pistol in his gloved hand. "You thought you could skim off the Pendleton accounts, Tommy Litt." Lorenzo's voice was a low, melodic baritone that echoed off the high, corrugated ceiling. "Did you really think my accountants wouldn't notice?" "The Pendleton accounts?" Beatrice pressed a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with sheer terror. The dead man's shell company. She hadn't stumbled upon corporate fraud. She had walked straight into a MAFIA execution. "Lorenzo, please, I swear to God." The man on his knees sobbed. "God doesn't handle the books, Tommy. I do." Foot! The suppressed gunshot sounded like a heavy staple gun. The man crumpled to the floor, a pool of dark red expanding rapidly around his head. Beatrice squeezed her eyes shut, a whimper clawing at her throat. She stepped back, frantic to escape, but her wet boot slipped on the slick concrete. She lost her balance, throwing her arms out to catch herself. Her heavy frame collided with a precarious stack of empty metal paint cans. The clatter was deafening, ringing out like an alarm bell in the dead silence of the warehouse. "Well," Lorenzo's voice cut through the noise, eerily calm. "It seems we have an audience." Panic seized Beatrice's chest. She scrambled to her feet, her chest heaving, and bolted toward the side door. But she wasn't fast enough. Two enormous men in dark suits emerged from the shadows, blocking her exit. One of them grabbed her arms, pinning them behind her back with a brutal, unbreakable grip. "Let me go. Please," she screamed, thrashing against his hold, but her strength was nothing against the hardened enforcer. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. Lorenzo Costa stepped into her line of sight. Up close, the danger radiating from him was suffocating. He had sharp, aristocratic features and eyes the color of dark, bruised storm clouds. He looked down at her, taking in her soaked hair, her flushed, terrified face, and the undeniable curve of her plus-size figure trembling in the cold. He didn't look at her with the disgust or dismissal Beatrice was so used to seeing in men's eyes. Instead, his gaze was dark, heavy, and intensely analytical. He reached into her coat pocket, pulling out the folded printouts of the ledger she had brought with her. Lorenzo scanned the papers. A slow, terrifying smile curved his lips. Beatrice Gallagher. He read the name printed at the top of the audit log. He looked back up at her, stepping so close she could smell the expensive bergamot cologne mixed with the metallic scent of fresh blood. "You found the missing 3 million. My own men have been looking for it for a month." I won't tell anyone," Beatrice stammered, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "I'll quit my job. I'll leave Chicago. You'll never see me again." Lorenzo reached out his leather-gloved thumb, tracing the line of her trembling jaw. The gesture was shockingly gentle compared to the violence he had just committed. "Leave," he murmured, leaning in until his lips brushed her ear. "Oh, Beatrice, you're far too brilliant to let go. And I'm a man who keeps what belongs to him." He nodded to his men. "Take her to the estate." Beatrice awoke to the blinding glare of morning sun reflecting off crystal chandeliers. She bolted upright, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, expecting the damp, terrifying walls of a dungeon. Instead, she found herself in a sprawling, opulent bedroom. The walls were lined with dark mahogany. The bed was drowning in Egyptian cotton, and tall French doors overlooked a meticulously manicured garden. It was a cage, but it was gilded in gold. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, realizing she was no longer in her damp clothes. She was wearing a silk nightgown that shockingly fit her generous curves perfectly. The sheer violation of knowing someone had undressed her sent a fresh wave of panic through her. The heavy oak door clicked open, and Lorenzo Costa walked in. He was out of his murder attire, dressed flawlessly in a tailored navy suit, looking every bit the legitimate businessman he pretended to be. He carried a silver tray with a steaming cup of coffee and a croissant. "Good morning, Beatrice," he said, smoothly setting the tray on a small side table. "Where am I?" she demanded, pulling the silk duvet up to her chin, acutely aware of her exposed arms and the heavy swell of her breasts. "Let me go. My boss will notice I'm missing. My roommate. Your boss, Gregory Walsh, received an email from your account at 6 a.m. resigning for a sudden family emergency," Lorenzo interrupted smoothly, sitting in a velvet armchair near the bed. "Your roommate thinks you've gone to visit your ailing aunt in Ohio. I've taken care of the details. I always do." Beatrice stared at him, the reality of her situation sinking in like a stone in a freezing lake. "You're kidnapping me." "I am employing you," Lorenzo corrected, steepling his fingers. "The men I hire to manage my finances are loyal, but they are unimaginative. They miss things. You, Beatrice, are an artist with numbers. I want you to run the Costa Syndicate's books. I won't do it. I won't work for the Mafia. Lorenzo's dark eyes hardened, the pleasant veneer slipping to reveal the ruthless killer beneath. He stood up, closing the distance between them until he was towering over the bed. "You misunderstand your position," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "This is not a negotiation." Over the next 3 days, Beatrice learned the true extent of Lorenzo's power. She was kept on the top floor of his fortress-like estate in Lake Forest. Armed guards patrolled the corridors, and every window was shatterproof glass reinforced with steel mesh. But the true twist came on the 4th night. Lorenzo summoned her to his private study. The room was massive, dominated by a heavy, ornate leather chair that looked less like furniture and more like a monarch's seat. Lorenzo was sitting in it, nursing a glass of scotch. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to a heavy wooden chair opposite his desk. Beatrice complied, refusing to shrink under his intense gaze. She had spent her whole life trying to take up less space. Here, facing a monster, she stubbornly refused to cower. She sat with her back straight, her chin raised. "Before you begin your work," Lorenzo said, tossing a thick manila folder onto the desk between them, "there is something you need to understand about why you are really here." Beatrice hesitated, then reached out and opened the folder. Inside were birth certificates, old photographs, and financial records. She froze. The name on the top document wasn't hers. It was William Gallagher, her father. The father who had abandoned her and her mother when Beatrice was only 7 years old. "My father," she whispered, confused. "Your father," Lorenzo confirmed, taking a slow sip of his drink, "was not a traveling salesman, Beatrice. He was one of my father's most trusted bookkeepers. He set up the shell companies at Midwest Global Freight. When he stole from us, my father had him dealt with." Beatrice felt the air leave the room. The room spun wildly. You killed my father." "My family did. Over 20 years ago," Lorenzo said, his gaze entirely devoid of remorse. "And when you applied to Midwest Freight 3 years ago, my men flagged your name. We let you take the job. We kept you there as an insurance policy. A pawn." Tears pricked Beatrice's eyes, not out of grief for a father she barely knew, but out of a profound, devastating betrayal. Her entire life, her struggles, her career, her independence, had been carefully monitored and controlled by the very monsters who had orphaned her. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice trembling with raw fury. Lorenzo stood up and walked around the heavy desk. He knelt in front of her, his large hands resting on the soft, thick flesh of her thighs. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, a confusing mix of terror and an entirely inappropriate dark heat. "Because," Lorenzo murmured, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a length of heavy silver chain attached to a padded leather shackle. "I need you to understand that there is no returning to your old life. That life was an illusion." Before she could pull away, his hand clamped down on her ankle. With terrifying speed and precision, he snapped the leather shackle around her leg and locked it. He took the other end of the chain and secured it to a heavy iron ring bolted directly into the floor beside his massive throne-like chair. Beatrice gasped, pulling her leg, but the chain was unyielding. The metal clinked loudly in the quiet study. Lorenzo stood up, his hand trailing up her leg over her hip to grip her jaw. He tilted her face up to meet his dark, obsessive gaze. He leaned in until his lips brushed against her ear, sending a shiver down her spine. "You belong to the Underworld now," he whispered. As Lorenzo walked away to take a phone call, leaving her chained beside his desk like a captive prize, Beatrice looked down at the silver chain binding her. A cold, hard resolve began to freeze the tears in her eyes. Lorenzo Costa thought he had captured a helpless, overweight accountant who would break under the weight of his power. But Beatrice had spent her entire life navigating a world that tried to crush her. She knew numbers. She knew systems. And now she knew the Costa family's biggest secrets. If she belonged to the Underworld, she wasn't going to remain a prisoner in it. She was going to tear it down from the inside. The heavy silver chain remained a constant, chilling reminder of her reality. But as the harsh Chicago winter set in, the nature of Beatrice's captivity began to shift. Lorenzo Costa did not treat her like a prisoner of war. He treated her like a prized, fiercely guarded queen. He moved her workspace entirely into his cavernous study. By day, the shackle around her ankle allowed her enough length to reach the mahogany desk, the roaring fireplace, and the plush leather sofa. By night, she was escorted back to her opulent bedroom, locked behind a reinforced door. Lorenzo's fascination with her was absolute, bordering on a dark, consuming worship. He dismissed the syndicate's traditional enforcers from the room whenever she was present. He hired private seamstresses who dealt exclusively in high society plus-size couture to fill her wardrobe. He bought her dresses of rich emerald velvet and deep plum silk that clung to her heavy curves and draped elegantly over her wide hips. The world starves its women, forcing them into frail, brittle shapes, Lorenzo murmured one evening, standing behind her chair as she scrolled through offshore bank statements. His gloved hand rested heavily on her shoulder, his thumb tracing the soft, thick flesh of her neck. They lack substance. You, Beatrice. You are a woman of profound substance. You command the space you exist in. It was intoxicating the way he looked at her. For a woman who had spent 28 years being treated as invisible, Lorenzo's burning, undivided attention was a dangerous drug. A lesser woman might have succumbed to the Stockholm Syndrome, losing herself in the velvet trap of a powerful man's obsession. But beneath her soft exterior, Beatrice possessed a mind of diamond-hard resilience. She smiled politely at his compliments, she ate the lavish meals he provided, and she kept the syndicate's books with flawless, terrifying efficiency. But in the quiet hours of the night when the estate was silent, Beatrice was drawing up blueprints for a bloodbath. Before her kidnapping, Beatrice's only true escape from the crushing reality of her mundane corporate life had been her writing. In the privacy of her small apartment, she had been painstakingly crafting a long-form historical drama storytelling project. It was a sprawling, intricate epic, totaling nearly 10,000 words that detailed the slow, tactical dismantling of a corrupt, bloated royal court by a seemingly insignificant scribe. She had spent months studying the fall of dynasties, how the Borgias, the Romanovs, and the Tudors operated. She knew exactly how empires fell. They were rarely destroyed by outside invaders. They crumbled from within, poisoned by paranoia, misplaced trust, and the silent archivists who controlled the gold. Beatrice applied the ruthless logic of her historical drama straight to the Costa family tree. Through the ledgers, she learned the intimate secrets of every capo and lieutenant in the organization. She saw who was greedy, who was desperate, and who felt slighted. The syndicate was currently at an uneasy peace with a rival faction down in Miami, overseen by Lorenzo's fiercely ambitious uncle Albert Costa. Using the encrypted servers Lorenzo himself had provided, her Beatrice began her quiet sabotage. It was a masterpiece of financial manipulation. She didn't steal the money, she moved it. She created microscopic discrepancies in the routing numbers of Lorenzo's prime real estate developments in the South Loop, siphoning fractions of a % of the profits directly into a shell corporation registered under the name Apex Holdings. Then, using a secure, untraceable digital drop, she leaked the existence of Apex Holdings to Lorenzo's notoriously paranoid enforcer, a brutal man named Carmine. But she didn't leave her own fingerprints on the breadcrumbs. She carefully doctored the metadata to make it look as though the leaks were originating from Miami, from Uncle Albert. She was planting the seeds of a civil war, watering them with Lorenzo's own money, and waiting for the harvest. "You look tired, mia cara," Lorenzo noted one afternoon, pulling her away from the monitors. He unclasped the leather shackle from her ankle himself, a gesture of trust he had slowly begun to implement over the past month. "The numbers can wait." "The numbers never wait, Lorenzo," she replied, smoothly rubbing her ankle. "There's a shift in the maritime transport accounts. It requires my attention." "I have 1,000 men with guns," he said, pulling her flush against his chest, his hands gripping her thick waist. "And yet my most dangerous soldier is the woman sitting at my desk. Tell me, Beatrice, do you finally accept that you belong here?" She looked up into his stormy eyes, her heart beating a steady, calm rhythm. "I accept that I am exactly where I am meant to be." He kissed her a bruising, possessive claim. Beatrice kissed him back, letting him believe he had conquered her, all while calculating the exact date his empire would burn. The eruption of the Underworld happened in the bitter, freezing rain of early April. It began with a devastating car bomb in downtown Chicago that completely vaporized Lorenzo's lead lieutenant and shattered the fragile peace of the city. The Costa estate immediately went into absolute lockdown, transforming from a gilded cage into a suffocating military bunker. Searchlights cut through the stormy nights. Armed guards patrolled every corridor with assault rifles, and a palpable suffocating panic bled into the opulent mahogany walls. Lorenzo became a creature of pure wrath. Convinced by the meticulous breadcrumb trail of financial discrepancies Beatrice had masterfully laid, he believed his Uncle Albert down in Miami was orchestrating a hostile takeover. Lorenzo ordered a brutal retaliatory strike on the East Coast, effectively plunging the entire American syndicate into an all-out, bloody civil war. For 3 grueling weeks, the Costa family bled out. Crucial weapons shipments were seized by federal agents, safe houses were raided in the dead of night, and trusted men turned their guns on each other as paranoia reached a fever pitch. Lorenzo barely slept. He spent his days barking violent orders, and his nights pacing the floor of his cavernous study, relying entirely on Beatrice to keep the bleeding infrastructure of his empire afloat. "Move the liquid assets to the Cayman accounts," Lorenzo ordered her one evening. He looked entirely unraveled. His expensive white dress shirt was stained with dark, dried blood, and his usually perfectly coiffed hair was a wild mess. He leaned heavily against the edge of the desk, his dark eyes frantic and exhausted. "All of it. If the feds freeze the domestic fronts, we need the offshore reserves to buy new politicians. Use the master cipher." This was it. The precipice she had been quietly marching toward for months. The master cipher was the holy grail of the Costa Syndicate, a highly guarded 24-character alphanumeric code that authorized the irreversible transfer of the family's entire liquid fortune. It was billions of dollars accumulated over nearly a century of extortion, gambling, and blood. "Are you absolutely sure?" Beatrice asked. She kept her voice deliberately soft, playing the role of the obedient, terrified captive to perfection. The heavy silver shackle around her ankle clinked as she shifted her weight in the leather chair. "Once it's in the Cayman dark pool, Lorenzo, it's virtually untraceable. Even for us." "Do it!" He snapped his voice, cracking. He walked around the heavy desk and fell to his knees directly in front of her. The terrifying MAFIA boss buried his face in the soft, yielding expanse of her stomach, his large arms wrapping desperately around her thick waist. "You are the only thing in this rotting world I trust, Beatrice. They are all betraying me. But you are my anchor." the only pure thing left. She slowly reached out her fingers, stroking his dark hair with a cold, clinical detachment that would have terrified him if he could see her face. "I know, Lorenzo. I'm taking care of everything." He remained on his knees, clinging to her wide hips like a drowning man, as her fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. But Beatrice didn't route the billions into the Costa family's secure Cayman accounts. Instead, she initiated a ghost routing protocol she had spent 5 agonizing months building in the dead of night. The massive sum of money cascaded through a dozen dummy corporations, splintering into thousands of microscopic digital fragments before quietly reassembling in a private, heavily encrypted Swiss trust. The sole beneficiary of that unbreakable trust was not Lorenzo Costa. It was the estate of William Gallagher. Transfer complete. The massive dual monitors flashed a discreet, blinding green before instantly wiping themselves entirely clean. The Costa family accounts were dead, utterly completely empty, zeroed out. Suddenly the wail of high-pitched sirens pierced the quiet, rainy night. Not one or two, but dozens of them converging rapidly on the Lake Forest estate. The heavy rhythmic thud of tactical helicopter rotors vibrated the shatterproof glass of the study windows, rattling the crystal decanters on Lorenzo's bar. Lorenzo snapped his head, up his hand, instantly reaching for the heavy firearm holstered at his shoulder. "What is that?" The heavy oak doors of the study burst open, the wood splintering. Carmine Lorenzo's most ruthless enforcer stood in the doorway, bleeding profusely from a deep graze on his forehead. "Boss, it's the FBI, the DEA, and the State Task Force. They're breaching the perimeter. Someone gave them the architectural blueprints and disabled the gate codes." Lorenzo's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. He looked at the blank monitors, then looked down at the iron ring bolted to the floor where Beatrice's leather shackle now lay completely open and empty. He had given her the key weeks ago, a symbol of his arrogant trust. He looked up at her, the woman he thought he had broken, the fat, invisible accountant he had claimed as his personal property. Beatrice stood up. She smoothed down the heavy skirt of her expensive plum velvet dress. She didn't shrink. She drew herself up to her full height, allowing the sheer, commanding physical weight of her presence to entirely dominate the room. "Who do you think gave them the codes, Lorenzo?" she asked, her voice ringing with an icy, unshakable authority. Lorenzo froze, the profound betrayal hitting him harder than a bullet to the chest. "No. No, Beatrice, you wouldn't. The money!" He lunged frantically for the keyboard, furiously tapping keys with trembling, blood-stained hands. The screens showed nothing but access-denied errors and empty vaults. "Where is it? Where is my money?" "It was never your money," Beatrice stated, taking a slow, measured step back toward the hidden panic room door Lorenzo had arrogantly shown her a month ago. "It was blood money, and a large part of it belonged to the father you murdered." "I gave you everything," Lorenzo roared, the elegant aristocratic facade entirely shattered, revealing the desperate, pathetic monster beneath. "I made you a queen. I worshipped you, when the rest of the world ignored you. You chained me to a desk and expected me to be grateful." Beatrice corrected her eyes, flashing with a magnificent, triumphant fire. "You underestimated me from the moment I walked into that warehouse. You saw my body, you saw my weight, and you assumed I was weak, slow, and meant to be possessed. But empires aren't destroyed by outside armies, Lorenzo. They fall because of the invisible people who hold the keys." The terrifying sounds of heavy tactical boots and steel battering rams echoed up the grand marble staircase. The estate was falling. The king was dead. "I don't belong to the underworld, Lorenzo," Beatrice said softly, as she pressed the concealed biometric scanner under the edge of the desk. The massive floor-to-ceiling bookcase behind her slid silently open on hidden tracks. I own it. She stepped backwards into the dark, protective shadows of the hidden escape tunnel, just as the study doors were blown completely off their hinges by federal agents. As the bookcase sealed shut with a heavy thud, plunging her into safety, she heard Lorenzo roaring her name, a broken, ruined king screaming in the ashes of his own conquered empire. Beatrice Gallagher walked calmly into the darkness, a brilliant ghost with a billion-dollar fortune, leaving her heavy chains far behind. What a jaw-dropping finale. Beatrice didn't just break her chains. She shattered an entire MAFIA empire from the inside out, proving that a brilliant mind is the deadliest weapon of all. Did you see that ultimate betrayal coming? If this dark, twisted tale of power and revenge kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Share this video with your friends, and subscribe for more thrilling stories. Drop a comment. What would you have done?